3 days after his wife vanished, he stood in front of cameras with tears in his eyes and begged the public for help. His voice cracked perfectly. His hands trembled at exactly the right moments. He spoke like a devastated husband living through the worst nightmare imaginable. Neighbors felt sorry for him. Friends defended him online. Some people watching the interview even admitted they cried with him. But what nobody realized at that moment was something absolutely horrifying. According to investigators, the man pleading for his wife to come home already knew she was dead. Not only that, he allegedly knew exactly where her body was hidden. And while an entire state searched for answers, he calmly went to work, spoke with detectives, hugged family members, and carefully played the role of an innocent man trapped in tragedy. But behind the performance was a chilling reality. Police were dealing with someone they believed to be manipulative, intelligent, patient, and terrifyingly calculated. A man who thought he had planned the perfect murder. And for a while, it actually looked like he might get away with it. Because this case wasn't solved by one dramatic confession or some lucky accident, it became a psychological war between detectives and a suspect who constantly tried to stay one step ahead. Every interview became a chess match. Every sentence mattered. Every timeline had to be checked, rechecked, and broken apart piece by piece. Investigators would later say that the killer's biggest weapon wasn't violence. It was control. He controlled his emotions, controlled his words, controlled the image he showed the world. But eventually, something started slipping. Tiny cracks appeared in the story, small details that didn't quite fit together. And once detectives noticed them, they couldn't stop seeing them. The story begins in a quiet Colorado neighborhood where, from the outside, everything appeared completely normal. The couple looked stable, ordinary, successful, the kind of people neighbors waved to in the morning before heading to work. Nothing about the house screamed danger. Nothing hinted at the horror investigators would later uncover. But behind closed doors, according to people who knew them personally, the marriage had been deteriorating for a long time. Arguments reportedly became more frequent. Tension slowly built inside the relationship. Financial pressure, emotional distance, resentment, all the ingredients that sometimes exist beneath the surface before a tragedy explodes into reality. Yet even then, nobody imagined the situation would end in murder. Then came the morning that changed everything. When the husband contacted authorities, his story sounded believable enough. He claimed his wife was missing. At first, investigators treated the situation exactly as you would expect, a possible disappearance. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe something happened unexpectedly. Maybe she was in danger. Officers immediately began collecting information, interviewing relatives, checking nearby areas, and trying to establish a timeline of her last known movements. During those first hours, the husband appeared cooperative, calm but emotional, concerned but composed. He answered questions carefully and never appeared openly aggressive or defensive. In fact, some officers initially sympathized with him, but experienced homicide investigators understand something important. Innocent people and guilty people often say similar things in the beginning. The difference usually appears later in the details. And details became the foundation of this entire investigation. As detectives dug deeper into the timeline, they started noticing inconsistencies that were difficult to ignore. Nothing huge at first. No smoking gun. Just strange little contradictions buried inside ordinary conversations. The husband would describe certain moments differently depending on who he was speaking to. Small details shifted. Time frames changed slightly. His memory seemed unusually selective. He could explain some events with near-perfect clarity, yet became strangely vague when asked about other important moments. Individually, those things meant very little. People under stress make mistakes all the time. Trauma affects memory. Investigators knew that. But together, those inconsistencies slowly created suspicion. And then came the surveillance footage. Detectives began pulling security camera recordings from nearby businesses, traffic intersections, parking lots, and surrounding roads. Hours and hours of footage had to be reviewed manually. Most of it was completely useless. Cars passing by, empty streets, nothing remarkable. But investigators stayed patient because they knew one thing. Criminals often expose themselves when they believe nobody is watching. Eventually, buried inside countless hours of recordings, detectives noticed something unusual. A vehicle connected to the husband appeared in locations that didn't fully match his version of events. The timing felt wrong. The movements felt off. Suddenly, the timeline he had described started developing cracks. That discovery changed the tone of the investigation completely. From that moment on, detectives stopped viewing him primarily as a worried husband and began quietly considering the possibility that he was responsible for the disappearance itself. But suspicion alone means nothing in court. Investigators needed hard evidence, real evidence, something undeniable. So they started digging into every aspect of his life. Phone records became critical. Detectives examined calls, texts, location data, deleted activity, and digital patterns. What they found disturbed them. Certain actions appeared inconsistent with someone desperately searching for a missing spouse. There were periods of time that raised questions. Internet activity that looked suspicious in hindsight. Searches and behaviors that, when viewed together, painted the image of someone preparing for consequences rather than panicking over a disappearance. And perhaps most disturbing of all was how controlled he remained throughout the process. Investigators later described him as someone who seemed constantly aware of how he appeared to others, almost as if he were managing an image instead of reacting naturally. Meanwhile, the public became obsessed with the case. News stations covered the disappearance relentlessly. Online forums exploded with theories. Thousands of people analyzed interview footage frame by frame, trying to determine whether the husband looked genuinely devastated or secretly guilty. Some viewers defended him aggressively, arguing that grief affects everyone differently. Others became convinced there was something deeply unsettling about his behavior. People pointed to his body language, his tone of voice, the way he answered questions. Certain moments during interviews began circulating online because viewers thought his emotional reactions felt rehearsed. But detectives ignored the internet speculation. They focused only on evidence. And slowly, methodically, they began building something dangerous around him. Forensic investigators revisited the house multiple times. They examined rooms, fibers, stains, cleaning patterns, digital devices, trash disposal records, and microscopic evidence most people would never even think about. The terrifying thing about modern investigations is that crimes leave traces everywhere. Even when someone believes they cleaned perfectly, forensic science can reveal fragments of truth hidden beneath surfaces, trapped inside vehicles, or buried in digital records. And according to investigators, tiny details inside the home started contradicting the husband's narrative more and more. At the same time, detectives interviewed friends, coworkers, relatives, and neighbors. The portrait of the marriage became darker with each conversation. Some described tension behind closed doors. Others recalled uncomfortable arguments. Certain people mentioned controlling behavior. Financial stress reportedly weighed heavily on the relationship. And while none of those things prove murder, they gave investigators something important: motive. Still, prosecutors knew motive and suspicion were not enough. If they moved too early without enough evidence, they risked losing the case entirely. So police remained patient, quietly collecting pieces while the suspect continued believing he might still outsmart them. And that's what made this investigation so fascinating. The killer allegedly believed intelligence alone would protect him. He thought careful planning could overpower forensic science, overpower technology, overpower trained investigators. He underestimated one thing: patience. Because homicide detectives are often willing to spend months slowly dismantling someone's lies instead of rushing toward an arrest. As pressure intensified, investigators noticed the husband's behavior changing. Interviews reportedly became more tense. His responses grew increasingly defensive whenever detectives questioned certain parts of the timeline. Contradictions became harder to explain. The calm, composed image he had maintained so carefully began slipping little by little, and every new inconsistency only deepened police suspicion. Then investigators uncovered another major breakthrough. Digital tracking data reportedly contradicted his movements again. Devices placed him in areas he claimed not to have visited. Timelines stopped matching. Certain explanations became impossible to reconcile with technological evidence. And once digital forensics entered the case fully, the walls around him started closing rapidly. Imagine being in his position during this phase of the investigation. Every phone call from detectives probably felt dangerous. Every knock at the door potentially terrifying. Because once investigators start quietly collecting evidence against you, there's no way to know how much they already understand. And in many cases, police intentionally avoid revealing what they know. They let suspects keep talking, keep explaining, keep lying, because every lie becomes another piece of evidence later. Meanwhile, search efforts continued publicly, creating an almost surreal contrast. Volunteers searched for a missing woman while detectives increasingly believed the person standing beside them during press conferences might actually be her killer. It's one of the most disturbing aspects of cases like this. The performance, the deception, the ability to stand beside grieving families while secretly hiding the truth. Eventually, investigators believed they had enough evidence to move forward. But before making an arrest, detectives conducted crucial interviews designed to pressure the suspect psychologically. These conversations became critical turning points. Investigators confronted him carefully, introducing contradictions one piece at a time: surveillance evidence, digital records, timeline inconsistencies, behavioral observation. According to reports surrounding the investigation, the atmosphere inside those interviews became increasingly uncomfortable as detectives methodically dismantled his explanations. And this is where many intelligent killers fail. Not because they suddenly confess dramatically, but because maintaining a false reality under pressure becomes exhausting. Every fabricated detail must align perfectly forever. Every statement has to remain consistent. One contradiction creates another, then another. Eventually, the entire structure collapses under its own weight. Detectives reportedly noticed subtle shifts in his demeanor during questioning, moments of irritation, defensive language, attempts to redirect conversation, tiny psychological cracks appearing where confidence once existed. And the more pressure investigators applied, the more obvious it became that something was deeply wrong beneath the surface. Then came the moment investigators had been building toward for weeks. Authorities arrested him. The news shocked the community instantly. Many people simply couldn't believe it. Neighbors described him as intelligent, polite, quiet, and ordinary. Friends struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the accusations now dominating headlines. But investigators were convinced they had uncovered the truth behind the disappearance. And once prosecutors publicly revealed parts of the evidence, public opinion shifted dramatically. The trial became a media obsession. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors painted the picture of a calculated killer who believed he could manipulate everyone around him. They argued the crime was deliberate rather than impulsive, planned rather than accidental. Jurors heard about surveillance footage, forensic findings, digital inconsistencies, relationship problems, and behavior investigators considered deeply suspicious. Piece by piece, prosecutors reconstructed the timeline for the jury, showing how detectives slowly unraveled the story despite the suspect's efforts to maintain control. Perhaps the most haunting part of the entire case was how normal everything appeared before the murder. People often imagine killers as obviously dangerous individuals, but real investigations repeatedly show something terrifying. Many violent criminals blend into everyday life almost perfectly. They have jobs, friends, families, conversations, smiles, and sometimes, according to investigators, they can hide horrifying truths for years before finally being exposed. As the trial continued, emotional testimony filled the courtroom. Family members mourned not only the loss itself, but the betrayal surrounding it. Prosecutors argued that the husband didn't simply kill his wife, he manipulated an entire community afterward. He allegedly weaponized sympathy, appeared on camera, spoke to reporters, participated in searches, all while hiding what investigators believed was the truth. And yet, despite all his planning, all his control, all his attempts to appear intelligent and untouchable, tiny mistakes destroyed him. That's the part that fascinates criminologists about cases like this. Not the violence itself, but the unraveling, the psychology, the slow collapse of someone convinced they are smarter than everyone else. Criminals often imagine investigations as dramatic movie scenes where one genius detective magically solves everything overnight. Real investigations are usually slower, quieter, and far more methodical. Detectives review evidence repeatedly, reconstruct timelines endlessly, re-examine contradictions over and over until patterns emerge. And once patterns emerge, the truth becomes harder to hide. By the end of the trial, the image of the grieving husband had completely shattered. In its place stood a convicted killer whose intelligence ultimately failed to save him. The very arrogance that made him believe he could outsmart investigators became part of what exposed him, because overconfidence creates carelessness, and carelessness leaves evidence behind. But maybe the most disturbing thing about this entire case is realizing how easily the deception worked in the beginning. Think about it. If investigators had accepted his story without scrutiny, if they ignored the inconsistencies, if they failed to review footage carefully, if forensic teams overlooked microscopic evidence, the case might never have been solved. The killer may have walked free forever while everyone continued believing the performance. That possibility is terrifying because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about human nature. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the loudest. They aren't visibly evil. They don't always fit the image society expects. Sometimes they're calm, intelligent, friendly, controlled. Sometimes they know exactly how to appear trustworthy while hiding something monstrous underneath. And maybe that's why stories like this fascinate millions of people around the world. Not because of violence alone, but because they expose how fragile our instincts can be, how easily appearances deceive us, how someone can stand in front of cameras pretending to search for a victim while secretly knowing the truth all along. Even now, years later, the case continues haunting people who followed it closely, not just because of the murder itself, but because of the psychological manipulation surrounding it. The interviews, the lies, the performance, the illusion of innocence carefully maintained until investigators finally tore it apart piece by piece. And somewhere inside evidence rooms, interview recordings, surveillance files, and courtroom transcripts sits the complete story of a man who believed he had committed the perfect crime, until the smallest details betrayed him, until investigators noticed what others missed, until the mask finally slipped, and the truth hiding underneath became impossible to ignore.